The observation post, designated Vigilance Node Gamma 7, hung in the sterile void between the Cathar hegemony's primary nexus and the erratic, resource-rich Perseus arm. From this vantage point, Fleet Commander Xylar could observe the, messy, unpredictable expansion of the younger races without the bothersome need for direct, costly entanglement. Xylar was a member of the Cygnian Ascendancy, a species whose existence spanned 27 millennia. Their chitinous exoskeleton, the color of polished obsidian under the soft filtered spectrum of the station's internal lighting, afforded natural radiation shielding. Their 4 primary manipulator limbs ended in delicate triple-jointed digits, perfect for manipulating the sensitive psionic relays that formed the core of Cygnian technology. He adjusted the biocradle that supported his secondary sensory organs, the ones designed to process the chaotic electromagnetic noise generated by developing civilizations. Currently, his focus was the newly admitted member species, Homo sapiens, the Terrans. Report on Sector Delta 9 assessment, Emissary Thrak. Xylar transmitted. The thought patterns relayed directly into the auditory membranes of the other Cygnian seated across the command dais. Thrak, younger and bearing the slightly iridescent sheen of recent maturation, shifted its weight, causing the hydraulic cushions beneath its lower thorax to emit a low, almost imperceptible sigh. Commander, the data compilation on the Terran military capacity is complete, cross-referenced with the cultural integration projections provided by the Xenolinguistics Division. The conclusion remains statistically robust. Thrak's mental voice was sharp, efficient, lacking the contemplative nuance Xylar preferred. Robustness in the face of what, emissary? Their initial integration package was noisy. They possess technology that should, by all known scaling laws, render them incapable of operating complex FTL drives without frequent catastrophic failure. Yet they persist. Thrak projected a crisp, three-dimensional schematic onto the central holographic projector. It depicted a stylized human figure overlaid with vectors of kinetic impact and thermal saturation. Persistence is a biological imperative, Commander, not a strategic asset. Their warfare doctrine remains primitive. Overwhelming kinetic force paired with inefficient chemically fueled propulsion. Their defense grid, a patchwork of orbital kinetic barriers and localized radiation bursts, is laughably thin. Our projected assimilation timeline remains 9 cycles. Xylar tapped a digit against the console. The sound, a dry click against the otherwise silent command deck. I am not concerned with assimilation timelines, Thrak. I am concerned with anomaly mitigation. We are teaching the sector cadre how to effectively disarm, pacify, and integrate the Terrans should they resist. The curriculum must be flawless. The Cygnian Ascendancy prided itself on minimizing conflict. Violence was waste. Careful, precise control was elegance. They had learned long ago that the fastest path to galactic stability was preemptive education, teaching the junior species the recognized parameters of interstellar interaction before they could damage themselves or others. The curriculum is impeccable, Commander, Thrak insisted, drawing up a subfile. The primary instructional unit, designated Terran Vulnerability Analysis, is currently being presented in the Grand Collegiate Amphitheater on Cygnus Prime. Admiral Krell is leading the session for the sector cadre students. And the humans cooperating with this instruction? Xylar inquired, a subtle thread of apprehension entering his tone. They are compliant, Commander.
They are being managed. Their appointed ambassadors are highly agreeable, keen to prove their species' sincerity regarding integration. They provided the full schematics of their standard infantry armament, their primary starship configuration, and even detailed psychological profiles. Xylar leaned back, his compound eyes focusing distantly on the swirling nebulae outside the viewport. It was too easy. The inherent risk in dealing with a species that had mastered fusion power within 4,000 years of organized thought was their volatility. The Terrans were volatile. They were loud, biologically fragile, and possessed an almost pathological need to alter their immediate environment. Thrak, detail the core vulnerability assessment for me once more. I need to ensure no latent threat vectors have been overlooked during this instructional phase. Thrak readily complied, his projections shifting to mimic the pedagogical style of the Grand Collegiate. We classify the Terran as a Class D biological threat. Vulnerabilities are extensive and immediate. The schematic zoomed in on the human torso. First, skeletal integrity. A standard kinetic slug, even at low relativistic velocity, causes catastrophic structural collapse. Their endoskeleton is mineralized calcium phosphate, brittle. A high-frequency sonic pulse set at 1.2 terahertz causes immediate internal cavitation. Death is rapid, minimizing collateral psychic trauma. Agreed, XLR murmured. Their internal scaffolding is laughably weak compared to our crystallized silicon matrices. Second, circulatory shock. Their primary life support is a pressurized circulatory system pumping oxygenated iron-bearing hemoglobin. Puncture wounds, even minor ones, result in rapid depressurization. A specialized neurotoxin derived from the Vlar swamp flora, which we have synthetically replicated, attacks the hemoglobin receptor sites, causing irreversible clotting cascades. The subject dies from systemic shutdown within 3 minutes. We have tested this on 500 live specimens provided by the Terran liaison. Xylar's primary auditory membrane twitched. The lethality rate? 99.99% within the designated time frame. The one anomaly survived a partial dose due to a known genetic anomaly, a hyper-efficient liver enzyme system. It was euthanized via thermal application. As per protocol. Good. Efficiency in application is paramount. Third, and most concerning for protracted engagement, neural overload. Their central processing unit, the brain, is densely packed soft tissue suspended in cerebrospinal fluid. It is highly susceptible to electromagnetic interference. A directed pulse from a standard Cygnian stunner applied to the frontal lobe region causes immediate, non-recoverable systemic shutdown. They cannot effectively process stimuli beyond the spectrum of their own rudimentary sensors. Thrak concluded, his posture conveying self-satisfaction. Commander, the curriculum is designed to teach the sector cadre, the newly promoted Cathar and Zidonian tactical officers, precisely these 3 points. They will be taught that a Terran combatant is neutralized by blunt force trauma, circulatory interruption, or simple neural silencing. They will learn that the Terran is soft, fragile, and easily managed. Confident. Xylar accepted the assessment. It aligned perfectly with all external observation. Humans were prone to disease, required constant thermal regulation, perished easily from minor injury, and possessed a short, frantic lifespan. They were a fleeting biological phenomenon, not a true interstellar power. Proceed with the archival of the lesson plans, emissary. I will observe the primary demonstration via remote link. Ensure that Admiral Krell understands the cultural necessity of subtlety in the pacification phase. We do not want unnecessary destruction of valuable biological resources. Understood, Commander. Subtlety and efficiency. The Grand Collegiate Amphitheater on Cygnus Prime was a marvel of bioengineered architecture. The immense space, capable of seating 50,000 observers, was carved from living, photosynthesizing crystal that shifted hue based on the collective emotional state of the audience. Today, the crystal thrummed with a pale, expectant violet, the color of focused intellectual curiosity. Admiral Krell, a venerable Cygnian strategist whose primary carapace plating was the deep dough gray of immense age, stood at the central command podium. He did not use holographic projections. His presence alone commanded attention. Below him, arrayed in precise, segmented tiers, sat the cadre. 37 high-potential officers from the hegemony's allied younger races, now being trained in the subtlety of assimilation. Among them were the blocky, hyper-efficient Cathar war engineers and the twitchy, energy-sensitive Zidonian inquisitors. Krell projected his voice, translating complex Cygnian harmonics into the common galactic standard, which sounded in the chamber like liquid metal flowing over stone. Observe, cadets. We study the Terran Homo sapiens, a species that, despite possessing rudimentary stellar travel capabilities, clings stubbornly to biological processes that should have rendered them extinct millennia ago. Their inherent weakness is their defining characteristic. Krell gestured toward the center of the demonstration floor, which shimmered, coalescing into a perfect, full-scale simulation environment. It was a perfect replica of a Terran urban military outpost, concrete, dust, and the faint, simulated odor of burnt hydrocarbons. The simulation will portray a hostile Terran unit, Krell continued. 3 combatants, standard infantry loadout. They operate under the assumption that they are safe. They are never safe. A simulated human squad materialized. They wore bulky olive-drab coverings and carried long, black kinetic weapons. They moved with a surprising, jerky quickness that suggested underlying anxiety. Disgusted. Note the gait. Disgusted. Unbalanced. They rely heavily on visual input. Their hearing range is narrow. They compensate for this sensory deprivation with noise, constant, unnecessary communication. A Cathar officer, designated Unit 734, stood in the first tier, its multifaceted eye clusters fixed on the scene. Curious, Admiral, the bio reports indicated they utilize vocal cords for communication. Is this not inefficient? Extremely, Krell agreed, a flicker of playful amusement crossing his photoreceptors. Now, cadre, watch the application of the first principle, skeletal compromise. Krell tapped a control. A silent, invisible wave of compressed atmospheric pressure, tuned precisely to the resonant frequency of human bone density, swept across the simulation floor. The 3 simulated humans did not explode, nor did they shatter into dust. Instead, they folded. It was horrifyingly quick. The armor plating buckled inward as the support structure beneath it simply ceased to resist external pressure. They collapsed into heaps of slack, pliable material, their kinetic rifles clattering uselessly onto the simulated concrete. Fatal systemic shock from internal organ crushing, Krell narrated calmly. No significant damage to the surrounding environment. Clean, effective, and achieved at a distance of 300 standard meters. The Terran is fundamentally incapable of surviving the basic physics of a focused pressure wave. The cadre murmured appreciative clicks and whistles of approval. The demonstration was flawless. Now, we transition to closer engagement, Krell announced. Unit 734, Cadet. You will demonstrate the second principle, circulatory interruption. Utilize the Zidonian Bioscourge injector. Unit 734, eager to prove its competence, approached the simulated perimeter. It raised a specialized syringe, its tip coated in the synthetic Vlar toxin. It stepped over the collapsed forms of the first simulated humans, mere biological sacks now, and approached the third, which was still twitching faintly, trying to reorient itself. Inject into the upper musculature cluster, Krell advised. Observe the neurochemical cascade. Unit 734 moved with practice speed, plunging the needle into the simulated arm of the downed human. The simulation immediately rendered the internal processes. A sickeningly bright red surge appeared around the injection site, spreading rapidly through the veins. The simulated human spasmed once, its head jerking upward, and then went utterly still. 3 minutes, 12 seconds, Krell stated, consulting his chronogauge. Even with their crude biological resilience, the synthetic Vlar agent proved effective. They bleed out internally, starved of oxygen transport. Lethal. Predictable. The cadre was satisfied. The lesson was clear. The Terrans were fragile constructs held together by thin membranes and pressurized liquid. Finally, Krell said, his voice dropping slightly, signaling the importance of the final module. Neural silencing. This addresses the scenario where kinetic or chemical agents are undesirable. Cadets, observe the Terrans' reliance on their primitive visual cortex. He activated the final stage. The simulation changed. The environment remained the same, but now 2 new simulated humans appeared, clad in slightly bulkier armor command elements. They were moving cautiously, scanning the perimeter. Cadet Zinn, demonstrate the directed pulse emitter. A Zidonian officer stepped forward, raising a slim pistol-sized device that crackled with contained energy. The Zidonian focused the narrow beam onto the head of the lead simulated commander. The beam struck. The simulation immediately showed a localized surge of chaotic energy washing across the Terran's skull. The simulated commander stopped mid-stride, its body freezing in an unnatural posture, before slumping over. 0.3 seconds activation time, Krell summarized. Complete cognitive erasure. They cannot fight what they cannot perceive, and we can extinguish their perception instantly. Krell turned to face the assembled cadre, the crystal floor shifting to a confident, deep blue. Cadets, you have seen the 3 pillars of Terran neutralization. Their biology is their cage. They cannot survive pressure, they cannot survive poisoned circulation, and they cannot survive a targeted neural spike. They are, for all intents and purposes, a hazard we have learned to manage before it can become a threat. The lesson is concluded. You are dismissed to begin final tactical integration drills. The assembly began to disperse, a wave of satisfied, low-frequency communication washing through the hall. The Terrans were officially classified as Managed Risk, Low Priority. Admiral Krell began to ascend the podium, preparing to leave the demonstration floor. The work was tedious, but necessary. He had just ensured that the next wave of hegemony expansion would proceed smoothly, without unnecessary expenditure of advanced weaponry on a species that clearly lacked the necessary physical fortitude for true interstellar conflict. As the last of the cadre filed out, 2 non-Cygnian technicians began the process of scrubbing the simulation field.
Krell paused near the periphery, waiting for the decontamination cycle to complete, the violet glow of the crystal fading to a neutral white. Then, a flicker. It was faint, almost lost in the background static of the residual energy field. Krell extended a delicate sensor probe toward the simulated concrete floor where the first group of humans had collapsed under the pressure wave. "Technician Rix, halt the purge cycle," Krell transmitted sharply. "Run a detailed spectral scan on the primary target residue." Rix, a young Kthar technician, hesitated. "Admiral, the collapse geometry suggests full structural failure. There is no residual biosignature to analyze." "Just execute the scan, Cadet. I detected an anomaly in the kinetic damping feedback." The scanner hummed, focusing on the spot where the first simulated human's upper torso had caved inward. The Kthar analysis software began compiling the data, cross-referencing the projected damage model with the simulated input parameters. The readout flashed red, an fearful warning signal Krell had only seen a handful of times in his long service, usually when dealing with rogue black holes or unpredictable plasma flares. "Admiral, the readings, they are impossible," Rick stammered, its voice modulator pitching high with confusion. "The input pressure was calibrated to induce instantaneous death via internal compression." Krell lowered his head, studying the display. The simulation, despite its perfect adherence to the input parameters, had generated a result that defied the established physics of Class D biologics. "Detail the discrepancy, Rix." "The primary skeleton structure registered a momentary spike in energy absorption after the collapse threshold was breached. It is as if the substrate was briefly reinforced against the initial impact. Furthermore, the surrounding dermal layer registered a massive localized thermal bloom, instantaneous. Not from external source, Admiral, internal." Krell felt a prickle of something cold, the closest his species could come to alarm, traveling across his carapace. "What are you suggesting, technician?" "I am suggesting, Admiral, that the simulation's response to the fatal trauma was not the expected biological relaxation. It indicates resistance. The target, it briefly resisted the collapse mechanism, utilizing a massive internal energy expenditure before succumbing." Krell walked toward the center of the inert stage, his movements precise and slow. He stared at the spot. The simulation had taught the cadre how to kill a human by destroying its structure. But what if the human structure was designed inherently to be destroyed? And what if the inherent flaw wasn't the structure itself, but the time it took to destroy it? Run the scenario again, Rix, but this time reduce the resonant frequency pulse by 50%. We want to see if the system registers the attempt to resist rather than the failure. Rix hesitated only a fraction of a second before complying. The field reset. 2 new simulated humans materialized, moving with that familiar, slightly anxious Terran stride. Krell ordered the lowered pressure wave deployed. The simulated humans staggered. They did not collapse instantly. Instead, they clutched their chests, emitting faint, simulated sounds of distress. They were hurt, clearly, but, surprised, they remained upright. "See, Rix?" Krell noted.
Slightly relieved. 50% efficacy reduction. Manageable. Then, the change happened. The simulated humans stopped staggering. They looked around, their visual inputs locking onto the source of the attack, which, in the simulation, was the energy projector Rix was currently holding. The first simulated human, the one Krell had identified as the assumed commander, did something that was, surprised, never cataloged in the millions of hours of Cygnian observation data concerning Terran combatants. Surprised. It began to heal. It was not a slow cellular regeneration. It was instantaneous, violent repair. The internal trauma indicators vanished. The thermal signature spiked to an impossible level, and the human's body seemed to inflate momentarily under the pressure of sudden, explosive internal energy redirection. It pointed its kinetic rifle at the simulated Krell. "Admiral, look at the biomechanics!" Rix cried out, the desperate in its voice modulator genuine. "Its respiratory rate has tripled. Its musculature is exhibiting hypercontraction beyond cataloged Terran physiological limits." The simulated human fired its kinetic weapon at the control nexus where Admiral Krell was observing. In the simulation, the impact was devastating. The nexus shattered, the holographic display dissolving into fragmented light. Krell recoiled instinctively, his sensory organs overwhelmed by the abrupt sensory change. "Angry! Cease simulation!" Krell barked, overriding the automated safety protocols. The stage snapped back to neutral white. The sound of the simulated gunfire echoed only in Krell's immediate processors. Rix, nervous, trembling, managed to access the lingering data from the final frame. "Admiral, fearful," Rix whispered, his voice weak. "The projectile, the kinetic round, it registered a velocity of Mach 4.2. That requires immediate, massive energy mobilization from the subject. The standard Terran infantry rifle, as documented by their liaison, fires a maximum of Mach 2.8. Krell stared at the empty space where the simulated human had stood, a human that had somehow, upon being injured by a teaching tool, accessed latent biological capabilities far beyond their documented norms, and fired a weapon exceeding its known limitations. "The lesson," Krell transmitted, his thoughts slow and heavy. The lesson was based on the documented capabilities of the Terran under normal operational stress. He looked over at the remnants of the shattered projection nexus. "But the Terran liaison provided us with their standard infantry loadout, not their emergency loadout, not their peak performance profile." Krell realized with a cold dread that settled deep within his core that the cadre had just been taught 3 highly effective ways to kill an average human. But what happens when the target isn't average? "Rix, desperate!" Krell commanded, his obsidian plating darkening further. "Recall Emissary Thrak. Contact the observation node immediately. Cancel the assimilation projections. Tell Commander Xylar that the Terran vulnerability analysis is incomplete. We need to know precisely what kind of energy system that creature utilized to survive that initial shock. We have fundamentally misjudged the baseline." He looked back at the empty stage, the melancholic silence of the massive hall suddenly oppressive. "They taught the class how to kill a human," Krell muttered to himself, a surprised, chilling realization dawning upon him. "But that one simply corrected the lesson. He didn't show us how to fail to kill one. He showed us how to make one exponentially stronger when injured." The hook was set. The lesson they thought they had perfected was, in fact, the mechanism for weaponizing their supposed weakness. And the real Terran combat profile remained entirely unread. Krell transmitted his urgent directive toward the external relays, the transmission a tight band of concentrated mental anxiety that bypassed the normal filtering protocols of the Cygnian network. The silent plea for immediate status review was already surging toward Vigilance Node Gamma 7, where Commander Xylar was undoubtedly reviewing the flawed pedagogical success report. Serious. Confirm the frequency signature of the energy output from the simulated projectile. I need spectral overlap with documented Terran munitions, specifically the experimental variants rumored to be utilized by their long-range reconnaissance units, the ones they claimed were decommissioned 2 centuries ago. Rix, still reeling from the visual evidence of the simulated human recovering from near-fatal structural damage, rapidly cycled through the data logs. Surprised. Admiral, the simulation engine utilized standard energy coefficients for a 120mm kinetic penetrator, but the emission profile post-impact is completely foreign. It suggests a localized energy amplification event coinciding with projectile exit velocity. It's like they added thrust after the launch sequence completed. Krell walked away from the inert demonstration floor, his movement regaining its characteristic measured pace. Though the underlying agitation remained, he moved toward a secured auxiliary terminal, overriding the standard safety locks with his senior command clearance. He needed external confirmation, hard data divorced from the potentially flawed, simulated parameters. I am overriding the standard observation protocols. Rix, initiate a high-gain scan on Terran Cultural Archive designation Mars Colony Operational Log 44 Beta. I want analysis on any documented failure modes that result in spontaneous structural reinforcement. The archive was protected by layers of intergalactic security protocols, data that the hegemony had deemed too complex or irrelevant to integrate into the main database. It represented the deep, messy history the Terrans had provided, the information they clearly hadn't intended for the cadre to study. The terminal sputtered, the sheer density of unprocessed, unindexed Terran data straining the Signian interface. Admiral, the data ingress is slow. The files are highly encrypted, layered with obsolete compression techniques. It's chaotic. Chaos is what they specialize in, technician. Push through it. A moment later, a mysterious, single, grainy, black and white image resolved on the auxiliary screen. It was a schematic of an armored vehicle, crudely drawn, yet undeniably Terran military hardware. Beside it, lines of text scrolled in the frantic, angular Terran script. Linguistics analysis reports this term frequently, Rix murmured, accessing the Terran glossary. Overclocking. It seems to be a term for artificially maximizing the performance output of a system beyond its design safety parameters. Krell focused on the schematic. The vehicle was rudimentary, heavy, relying on combustion and mass for its function. They overclock their primitive machinery? Why introduce such instability? The analysis suggests, Rix continued, scrolling through a translated passage, that the risk of catastrophic failure is outweighed by the tactical advantage of achieving a higher output for a short, crucial duration. Krell felt the smooth shell of his composure cracking. The Signian ascendancy had spent millennia engineering failure out of existence. Instability was anathema. To willingly invite catastrophic failure for a temporary gain was the height of strategic idiocy. Unless, of course, the idiocy was the calculated variable. Just as Rix managed to pull up a snippet of operational data detailing the overclocking procedure for that specific vehicle, the main command console flared to life.
Commander Xylar's mental presence flooded the chamber, sharp, cold, and radiating angry frustration. Krell explained the immediate shutdown of the Grand Collegiate demonstration. My incoming telemetry shows a massive procedural breach and unauthorized data retrieval targeting deep storage archives. Krell straightened, projecting calm he didn't feel. Commander Xylar, the demonstration was terminated due to critical miscalculation in the primary input parameters. The established vulnerability matrix for Homo sapiens is invalid. Invalid? By what authority? The data provided by the Terran liaison was ratified by 4 separate xenocultural boards. Explain this miscalculation immediately, Admiral. Zylar's mental tone was becoming dangerously sharp, the equivalent of chitin grinding against steel. Commander, we taught the cadre how to inflict damage based on their observed norm. However, the Terrans possess an inherent, non-documented, perhaps even intentional mechanism for rapid, localized system reinforcement when subjected to lethal trauma. Krell gestured toward the schematic on the auxiliary screen. They intentionally violate their own operating parameters. They overclock their biology under duress. Rix found the relevant data point from the archival stream, translating the deeply embedded Terran psychological profile notes. Commander, the Terran concept of fight or flight is not merely a neurochemical response. It appears to be an active, consciously triggered physiological shunt. When facing guaranteed termination via external force, they shunt excess metabolic energy, which they generate in vast quantities due to their short lifespan and high caloric requirements, directly into structural integrity and localized output systems. You are suggesting that injury makes them stronger? Not stronger, Commander, Krell corrected, his eyes fixed on the screen where the simulated human had momentarily exceeded its own weapon specifications. Faster, more volatile. They do not resist damage. They weaponize the attempt to destroy them. Krell leaned closer to the auxiliary terminal. The simulation, Zylar, was not teaching the cadre how to kill a human. It was teaching the cadre how to prime them. Suddenly, the internal lighting of the amphitheater flickered again, this time not due to simulation residue, but external power fluctuation. The emergency red lights, typically reserved for full-scale hull breach, bathed the chamber in an alarming glow. Rix, what is the external status?
Krell demanded. Rix scrambled back to the primary sensor display, his multifaceted eyes fearful, wide with horror. Admiral, the station's passive sensor net. Something just crossed the designated buffer zone. It's moving at impossible velocity, not adhering to predictive FTL exit calculations. Impossible! Zylar's projection screamed across the link. The buffer zone is protected by 3 layers of preemptive warp field distortion. Nothing can bypass it without our direct authorization. It didn't use a warp field, Commander, Rix choked out, rapidly inputting the spectral analysis of the inbound object. It's a single, massive kinetic signature. It utilized a trajectory that would be suicidally inefficient for any recognized power. A direct, linear plunge from beyond the outer marker. The primary viewport showing the sterile void. Abruptly filled with a terrifying visual. It wasn't a ship. It was too crude, too angular, yet impossibly fast. It was one of the Terran destroyer-class vessels. A ship they had catalogued as slow, clumsy, and overly reliant on chemical thrusters. But this one wasn't just fast. It was radiating a familiar, chaotic energy signature. Commander, Rix whispered, pointing at the spectral analysis overlapping the image of the incoming vessel. The energy signature of the external drive core. It matches the profile we observed in the simulation's final frame. It is overclocked. It is moving at a velocity that should vaporize the whole material. Krell stared at the incoming object. It was an ugly, brutish thing, yet it was screaming through the hegemony's meticulously structured buffer zone like a hurled stone. Its engines glowing with uncontrolled, volatile power. Xylar's voice returned, laced with disbelief. Disbelief! Thrak's report stated the Terran liaison was compliant. They gave us the schematics of their standard arsenal, Krell. They did not give us the schematics of their suicidal, desperate, emergency arsenal. They didn't give us the schematics of their standard arsenal, Commander, Krell corrected, a serious, grim finality in his tone as he looked at the ship bearing down on the station. They gave us the schematics of the version of themselves they wanted us to learn how to kill easily. They showed us the slow way. The incoming vessel executed a maneuver that defied known thrust-to-mass ratios. It didn't slow down. It rotated violently. Using directed bursts of plasma exhaust from its side arrays to execute an impossibly tight course correction, locking directly onto Vigilance Node Gamma 7. It's targeting the station's primary comms array. Rick shrieked, his voice modulator spiking with fearful adrenaline. It's not engaging strategically, Admiral. It's going straight for the throat. Krell didn't wait for a response from the distant Xylar. He didn't need to. If that vessel impacted the primary nexus, all hegemony intelligence regarding Terran vulnerability would be lost, and the sector cadre would be engaging a species that had just demonstrated the ability to turn existential threat into tactical amplification. Desperate, divert all auxiliary power to the localized shield emitters at Docking Bay 3. We are going to meet this overclocked missile. Admiral! Our standard shielding won't hold against that projected kinetic force, especially if their drive core is destabilizing that violently, Rix protested. Krell slammed his manipulator limb onto the manual launch sequence control for the amphitheater's emergency drone deployment system, a system designed for rapid debris clearance, not combat. Then we will not use shields, Technician. We will use the lesson we just learned. The emergency deployment bay doors hissed open, revealing the handful of maintenance drones, crude, boxy automatons equipped only with low-yield plasma welders and atmospheric scrubbers. They were designed to polish the crystal architecture, not engage enemy starships. Krell rapidly overlaid a new program onto the drone fleet's core AI, utilizing the precise parameters derived from the simulation's final devastating frame, the overclocked response. Rix! Synchronize the drone launch sequence with the moment of the Terran ship's closest approach. I am going to feed them a simulated, yet physically real, counter-trauma signature. If their response to injury is amplification, we need to make the injury so severe, so instantaneous, that the amplification mechanism collapses under its own strain. The Terran vessel was now close enough that the distortion wave from its engines was rattling the observation windows. The void outside was no longer sterile. It was filled with the violent, incandescent bloom of overloaded Terran technology. Admiral, the proximity warning is at 30 seconds. We can't deploy the drones in time to intercept a straight-line trajectory. We are not intercepting, Technician, Krell stated, his gaze locked on the data stream detailing the necessary energy curve required to cause immediate, systemic overload in a fusion core operating above 150% rated capacity. We are making them hurt faster than they can adapt. He initiated the drone launch sequence prematurely. The crude maintenance drone spat out into the void, tiny specks against the backdrop of the rapidly approaching Terran warship. They were not fast enough to block the ship, but they were positioned perfectly along its forward arc. Fire the welders, Rix! Full thermal output! Target the leading edge of the primary drive cowling! The tiny drones unleashed their meager plasma beams, mere tools for polishing crystal, now aimed at a starship moving at speeds that defied comprehension. The beams, weak and diffuse by standard military metrics, struck the rapidly accelerating hull. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. The Terran ship continued its trajectory, undeterred by the toy weapons. Then, the anomaly appeared again. Where the drone struck the hull, the metal didn't just melt, it screamed with energy feedback. The thermal signature from the point of contact spiked, echoing the internal bloom seen in the simulation. The Terran vessel, instead of maintaining its trajectory toward the station, shuddered violently. It hadn't exploded, it had reacted. The ship's movement became erratic, not because the drones had damaged its primary drive, but because the localized energy input had triggered the ship's own system to initiate an emergency, catastrophic self-reinforcement sequence. The drive core, attempting to heal the minor heat damage, instantly channeled far too much energy into the structural supports, causing a localized failure cascade in the opposite direction. The vessel began to tear itself apart, not from impact, but from its own desperate attempt to survive, an attack that was mathematically tailored to provoke its self-destructive resilience. "It's decoupling its forward section," Rix exclaimed, watching the primary hull segment spin violently away from the main engine block. "The attempted reinforcement, it destabilized the structural integrity of the adjacent reactor chamber." The main bulk of the Terran ship, its command section and primary reactor, lurched away from the station. Its forward momentum arrested not by defense, but by its own panicked, amplified reaction to minor damage. It tumbled into deep space, radiating heat and chaos, a self-inflicted wound bleeding energy into the void. Krell let out a slow, measured pulse of relief. They had survived the first contact. They had countered the first desperate attack by weaponizing the Terran instinct for survival. "Krell! Report! What was that signature? We detected massive, uncontrolled energy release in your immediate vicinity. The attack was neutralized, but the method used by the aggressor, it defies all known propulsion dynamics." Zyler's voice was tight, demanding immediate explanation. Krell looked at the silent, tumbling wreckage of the Terran vessel, a monument to their failure to understand the fundamental nature of their adversary. "Commander, the Terrans do not simply build machines or possess biology," Krell projected, stepping back toward the primary dais, the emergency red lights reflecting dimly off his shell. "They have engineered a species that treats existential threat as a power source. We have been studying their weaknesses, but we failed to understand their strength." He displayed the translated final line of the pilot's log. "If we cannot win by being stronger, we will win by being impossible to kill cleanly. Let them learn how hard it is to kill a ghost powered by its own destruction." Krell paused, letting the fearful, cold weight of the revelation settle across the entire hegemony network. "The lesson we learned today, Commander, is that when you wound a human, you do not kill them. You merely provide the input necessary for them to evolve mid-conflict," Krell stated. "And I have just discovered their true tactical paradigm." On Vigilance Node Gamma 7, Commander Zylar, the millennia-old Cygnian strategist, was fearfully struggling to process the implications of Krell's frantic data dump. His multiple compound eyes cycled rapidly through colors, from shocked white to a deep, questioning indigo. "Impossible! They weaponize injury? This violates every known scaling law of biological warfare. If this is true, Krell, then every resource we invested in the subtlety of assimilation curriculum has been based on a catastrophic fallacy." "It has, Commander," Crow confirmed grimly. Our entire strategy was predicated on their fragility. We assumed that low biological durability meant low tactical ceiling. We were wrong. Their low durability forces rapid adaptation. They do not have the luxury of millennia to perfect stability. They must perfect instantaneous reaction. Back in the amphitheater, Rix was still monitoring the spiraling wreckage of the Terran destroyer. "Admiral, the fragments of the ship are undergoing secondary energy cascade. It appears the overloaded reactor, as it disintegrated, released a focused energy pulse in a randomized vector. It wasn't aimed at us, Admiral. It was collateral damage from the internal system collapse." "Analyze that pulse, Rix, immediately."
Xylar's projection sharpened, taking on a new, desperate edge. "Krell, you must halt any further instruction to the cadre. If they attempt to apply the 3 pillars to a Terran combatant now, they will not pacify them. They will create 37 localized, massively amplified threats."
"Too late, Commander," Krell sighed, the sound surprisingly resonant in the vast hall. "The cadre has already disseminated the core tenets of Terran weakness. They believe they know how to neutralize them via kinetic, circulatory, or neural attacks." The main entrance to the amphitheater hissed open, not with the elegant movement of Cygnian personnel, but with the clumsy, heavy stomp of armored Kthar war engineers. They were the cadre members who had just received their final tactical briefing, the officers who now, sarcastic, believed they held the key to effortless occupation. Leading them was Unit 734, the Kthar officer who had demonstrated the kinetic pulse attack. Its multifaceted eyes, previously filled with anticipation, were now glowing with an intense, focused crimson, the Kthar display for maximum strategic readiness. "Admiral Krell," Unit 734 boomed, its voice translated into galactic standard, sharp, and utterly devoid of the civilized deference Krell was accustomed to. "Your demonstration of skeletal compromise was sound. However, we found the required parameters to be inefficiently delivered at a distance." Krell felt a sudden, profound sense of dread. They hadn't absorbed the caution. They had absorbed the method and optimized it using their own cultural leanings toward overwhelming kinetic efficiency. "Unit 734, cease movement. The parameters have been revised." "The Terran biological structure is inherently unstable under controlled pressure application. Attempts to force a collapse at the lower end of the spectrum may induce a counter-reinforcement response." Unit 734 ignored him, its heavy, blocky form moving directly toward the center of the demonstration floor, where the simulation remnants lay. "We have devised an improvement, Admiral," 734 declared. "Why rely on a subtle atmospheric resonance pulse that allows for latency? We will utilize directed, concentrated kinetic impact at the optimal calculated moment of structural weakness." The Kthar war engineer activated its primary armaments, not the training tools, but its full-spectrum siege weaponry, repurposed for internal demolition work. It aimed a massive, tri-barreled cannon directly at the point on the floor where the simulated human center of mass had been. "We are implementing the first pillar with optimized Kthar efficiency," 734 shouted triumphantly. "Stop! You are weaponizing the counter-stimulus!" Krell roared. But the Kthar were not Cygnian. They were driven by military doctrine, not contemplative elegance. A devastating volley of solid,
dense projectiles, projected at hyper-relativistic speed, slammed into the center of the demonstration floor. The impact was astronomical. The living crystal of the amphitheater groaned, cracks spider-webbing outward from the impact zone as the sheer kinetic force momentarily overwhelmed the architectural matrix. The Cathar officers cheered their display of brute force efficiency. But the ground did not collapse silently.
Nor did it simply crack. From the smoking impact zone, something erupted. It wasn't a human. The Cathar were too far away for that. It was an afraid explosion of raw, uncontained energy that vaporized the Cathar siege cannons instantly, followed by the Cathar officer himself. The thermal output was so immediate and focused that Unit 734 simply ceased to exist. No collapse, no shadow, just instantaneous molecular dispersal. Rick staggered back from his console, pointing a trembling manipulator at the spectral readings. "Admiral, the energy signature. It matches the Terran overload profile. But the source is not biological." Krell stared at the massive scorch mark where the Cathar officer had stood. The cadre had been trained to neutralize the human body. But the Cathar, misunderstanding the core concept, had applied the principle of amplification through injury to their own technology, using the method the Terrans used to reinforce themselves. "They are not the only ones who can adapt to perceived weakness," Krell whispered, finally understanding the irony. "The Cathar applied the Terran counter-mechanism to their own weaponry. They pushed their siege cannon far beyond its rated capacity to ensure maximum kinetic trauma. The energy spike wasn't a human retaliating. It was the Cathar weapon system, sensing the extreme kinetic load demanded by its operator, reacting exactly as the Terran did under duress. It overloaded its own systems to meet the impossible demand, resulting in catastrophic terminal failure. The Cathar had killed themselves, proving the doctrine worked too well. The remaining Cathar and Zidonian officers froze, the cheer dying in their sensory membranes. They had just witnessed their vanguard officer vaporized by his own optimized weapon, triggered by the very logic they were supposed to be learning. Krell, desperate, seized the moment, overriding the remaining cadre's command structure and linking directly to Xylar. "Commander, the Terran resilience is not a biological quirk. It is a foundational principle of their existence that spans their technology and their psychology. They thrive on the edge of failure. The moment we apply precise, overwhelming force, we teach them how to build a better defense against that specific force." On Gamma 7, Xylar processed the data stream, the impossible velocity of the destroyer, the self-immolation of Unit 734, the constant stream of contradictory Terran data flooding in from the Mars archives. "The twist, fearful," Xylar transmitted, his mental voice regaining a dreadful clarity, "is that their greatest strength is their short lifespan. They don't need time to develop stability. They only need a single crisis to force instantaneous technological and biological evolution. They are the universe's self-correcting malware." "Precisely, Commander," Krell confirmed, his voice steadying. "They provide us with the methods to kill their weakest iteration, and when we use those methods, they immediately discard the failed iteration and deploy the next, stronger one. The Cathar just proved it with their cannon." Rix, meanwhile, had finally parsed the deep Martian archives. His optical sensors widened to their absolute limit, processing a single, chilling document that redefined the entire purpose of the Terran military structure. Admiral, Commander Xylar, I have found the strategic overview for their Mars colonization phase. They didn't build those long-range reconnaissance cruisers, the ones we assumed were decommissioned, for defense or exploration. Rix projected the document onto the main screen. It wasn't a weapon schematic. It was a philosophical mandate. The Terrans knew they were entering hostile territory. They knew they would be observed by ancient, stable powers like the Ascendancy. They created a military doctrine based on one concept: the bait. The bait? Xylar queried, his previous panic replaced by profound intellectual shock. Yes, Commander, they built those crude, overly kinetic ships that look inefficient and easily countered by our established physics. They wanted us to observe them. They wanted us to study their apparent vulnerabilities. Krell stared at the screen. The red emergency lighting casting long, strange shadows across his carapace. The liaison provided us with the textbook on how to defeat the Terran they wanted us to fight. Exactly, Rix confirmed, scrolling to the final section of the document, which detailed the Controlled Loss Event protocol. When the Terran Command detected observation, they initiated this protocol. They intentionally sent that destroyer on a high-velocity, linear, suicidal trajectory toward the observation post. Why? Xylar demanded, his entire focus now shifted from assimilation to survival. Rick swallowed, though he had no biological need to. Because they knew you would study the failure. They knew you would analyze the self-destruct mechanism and attempt to replicate the required counterforce. The final phase of this protocol isn't about winning a battle, Admiral. It's about winning the intellectual war.
Rix highlighted the concluding paragraph. The true enemy of the hegemony is stability. The moment they understand our physics, they become predictable. Therefore, our first operational objective must be to force the enemy into an immediate, high-stakes application of our own evolving technology. We must teach the hegemony how to fight us by providing the lesson plan, and then immediately shatter that lesson plan with a proof-of-concept demonstration of the next iteration. Krell looked at the scorched floor where Unit 734 had been reduced to atomic dust, then at the distant, tumbling wreckage of the Terran destroyer. They sacrificed a starship, an entire command structure, simply to force us to test the boundaries of their own self-reinforcing physics, Krell summarized, an expression of terrible respect. They didn't just teach the class how to kill a human.
They taught the class how to create a stronger human, and then they used their own failing ship to prove the lesson was already obsolete. Xylar absorbed this. The Cygnian Ascendancy, 27 millennia old, had encountered a species that weaponized its own learning curve. Their stability, their arrogance of age, was suddenly their greatest vulnerability. Desperate, Krell, pull all Cadre personnel back to the main fleet sectors immediately. Terminate all integration protocols. We are ceasing observation. We are initiating immediate strategic withdrawal from the Perseus arm. Xylar's voice was stripped of all arrogance, replaced by the sober tone of a species that had just stared into an evolutionary abyss. We do not engage a species that learns faster than we can catalog. We do not fight a force that weaponizes its own mortality. And Commander?
Krell added, looking around the devastated amphitheater, a graveyard of alien assumptions.
We need to inform the hegemony leadership. We must categorize the Terrans not as a Class D biological threat, but as a self-modifying existential constant. He looked at Rix, who was already beginning to calculate the massive data migration required to erase all current tactical data on humanity. We are erasing the lesson, Rix, every fragment of it. We let them believe we retreated because they were too powerful to fight conventionally. Because that is the only narrative that guarantees they will stop pushing the envelope. Rix nodded slowly, his eyes reflecting the cold, fading light of the emergency lamps. Understood, Admiral. We bury the knowledge of their true capabilities. Krell looked back at the empty space where the Cathar officer had stood. The irony was complete. The one being who corrected the lesson, the pilot of the decoy ship, had used an evolved, amplified human capacity that only manifested when injured. He had taught the hegemony exactly what they feared most, that the fragile, short-lived Terrans were not merely durable, they were infinitely adaptive. Let them believe we fear their brute strength, Rix, Krell concluded, a strange sense of relief washing over him. Hopeful, it buys us the only currency we need now, time to study them from a distance without providing them the data necessary to force us to learn faster than we ever have before. As the remaining cadre officers shuffled out, shaken into an unprecedented silence, Krell surveyed the damage. They had entered the Terran sector seeking smooth assimilation and easy conquest. They were leaving with the crushing realization that the cost of making a human angry was the immediate necessity of reinventing their entire understanding of conflict. The amphitheater slowly transitioned from harsh red to a neutral, reflective silver, symbolizing the hegemony's decision to cease action and return to contemplation. The vast chamber, designed to teach the ease of subjugation, now stood as a monument to the day the Cygnian ascendancy learned that the key to surviving the younger races was to never, ever give them a reason to try their hardest. The only sound left in the chamber was the faint, residual electromagnetic hum of the data wipes, the sound of a galactic power desperately trying to forget the lesson that humanity had taught them, that fragility wasn't a weakness. It was simply the necessary precondition for becoming something utterly terrifying.